They mocked the revolution until the guillotine started killing. The winter air in Paris during the early months of 1793 does not merely bite the skin, it settles into the marrow, a cold so absolute that it feels like a physical weight pressing against the chest of every man, woman, and child gathered in the square. There is a specific kind of silence that precedes a catastrophe, a hollow, ringing void, where the sounds of the city, the barking dogs, the distant clatter of cartwheels, the crying of infants, seem to be swallowed by the grey stones of the pavement. Thousands of people are packed into the Place de la Révolution, yet the only sound is the collective rhythm of breath, rising in white plumes like the ghosts of 1,000 unspoken thoughts. They are waiting for a machine. It stands at the center of the stage, a tall skeletal frame of weathered timber and cold iron, silhouetted against a sky the color of a bruised lung. This is not a tool of justice in their eyes, not yet. It is a presence. It is a silent auditor of human conviction, waiting to balance the books of 1,000 years of history with a single gravity-driven stroke. The wood of the uprights is stained with the memory of those who came before, a dark, seeped discoloration that the morning frost cannot hide. This is the moment when the abstract ideals of the Enlightenment, the beautiful, soaring words of philosophers and orators, stop being ink on parchment and start being steel on bone. The guillotine does not argue. It does not debate the merits of a constitution. It simply functions. It is the ultimate bureaucrat of the new era, impartial, efficient, and utterly indifferent to the screams of the soul. Long before the blade became the heartbeat of the capital, there was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of the corridors of Versailles, a world draped in gold and silk, where the passage of time was marked only by the ritualized movements of a court that had forgotten the smell of the earth. In those gilded halls, power was a birthright, something as natural and unquestioned as the rising sun. Louis, the man who would become a target of the machine, was not a monster of legend. He was a man of quiet hobbies, a locksmith who found more comfort in the predictable mechanics of a metal bolt than in the volatile chemistry of a starving nation. He lived in a cocoon of tradition, surrounded by advisers who whispered that the rumblings in the streets were merely a fever that would pass with a good night's rest. But while the king adjusted his clocks, the world outside was dismantling the very concept of time. Hunger is a powerful catalyst for philosophical clarity. When the stomach is empty, the divine right of kings looks less like a mandate from heaven and more like a cruel joke told by those who have never known the gnawing ache of a week without bread. The transition from loyalty to resentment does not happen in a single day. It is a slow, agonizing erosion, a series of small betrayals that eventually collapse into a landslide. Every tax increase, every grain shortage, every dismissive glance from a passing carriage carved a deeper groove into the collective psyche of the people. They began to realize that the social contract was not a sacred bond, but a flimsy piece of paper that could be torn by hands calloused from labor. By the time the Bastille fell, the atmosphere had shifted from desperation to a terrifying kind of clarity. The walls of the fortress were not just stone and mortar. They were the physical manifestation of an invisible authority that had held the mind captive for centuries. When those walls were dismantled brick by brick, the people realized that the gods of the old world could bleed. This realization is the most dangerous moment in any civilization. It is the point where the fear of the master is replaced by the intoxicating scent of his vulnerability. In the salons of the intellectuals, lawyers and poets spoke of a new dawn, a republic of virtue where reason would reign supreme. They were men of books, men who believed that if you could only define justice clearly enough, the world would naturally align itself with your vision. They did not yet understand that reason is a fragile thing when placed in the hands of a mob that has been taught for generations that the only language of power is violence. They spoke of liberty, but the air was already beginning to smell of wet iron. The movement was no longer a protest. It was a living organism, a beast that required constant feeding to maintain its momentum. The moderate voices, those who sought a middle ground, found themselves increasingly isolated, their nuance viewed as a form of treason. In a revolution, there is no room for the grey areas of the human heart. You are either the hammer or the anvil, and the anvil is quickly being replaced by the block. The king's flight to Varennes was the final irreversible fracture. When the royal family was caught in that small town, disguised as commoners, the mask of the monarchy didn't just slip, it shattered. The image of the king, the father of the nation, trying to abandon his children in the dead of night, transformed him from a sacred figure into a fugitive. He was no longer the Lord's anointed. He was Louis Capet, a man whose presence had become a logistical problem for the new republic. The trial that followed was a masterpiece of political theatre, a psychological trial of strength, where the outcome was determined long before the first word was spoken. To spare the king was to admit that the old world still had a claim on the new. To kill him was to burn the bridge behind them, ensuring that there could be no retreat, no return to the comfort of the familiar. The revolutionaries were not just judging a man, they were attempting to murder the very idea of the past. They wanted to create a void where the crown used to be, believing that they could fill that emptiness with the pure light of the republic. But nature abhors a vacuum, and power, when stripped of its traditional robes, becomes a raw predatory thing that looks for a new host. As the carriage carrying Louis moved through the streets toward the square, the silence of the crowd was not one of respect, but of profound existential shock. They were about to witness the impossible. The king, whose face was on every coin they had ever held, whose name was invoked in every prayer, was being delivered to a technician in a red coat. The king sat in the carriage, clutching a prayer book, his face a mask of practiced stoicism. He was a man who had finally found his role, not as a ruler, but as a martyr. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that his death was the only thing he could truly give to his people that would be remembered. The journey took 2 hours, a slow crawl through a forest of bayonets and stony faces. There were no cheers, no insults, only the rhythmic thud of the horses' hooves and the heavy metallic clank of the escort's sabres. The city was a tomb. Shops were shuttered, windows were closed, and the very air seemed to hold its breath. This was the turning point, the agonizing moment when political idealism curdled into survivalist paranoia. Those who stood in the front rows of the crowd, the ones who had been the loudest in their calls for justice, now felt a cold shiver of realization. If the king's head could fall, whose head was truly safe? The machine at the center of the square was no longer a tool of the people. It was the new master of France. Louis stepped out of the carriage with a dignity that surprised even his enemies. He climbed the wooden stairs of the scaffold, the sound of his boots on the planks echoing like drum beats in the unnatural quiet. He attempted to speak, to address the thousands of souls watching him, to tell them that he died innocent and that he prayed his blood would not fall on France. But the drums began to roll, a thunderous mechanical roar designed to drown out the voice of the individual. The state did not want his words, it wanted his silence. The executioners, men who performed their task with the cold efficiency of butchers, moved in. They stripped him of his coat, tied his hands, and sheared his hair. The physical degradation was a necessary part of the ritual, the final stripping away of the divine to reveal the fragile, shivering animal beneath. He was pushed onto the plank, his neck fitted into the wooden collar of the lunette. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. The 1,000-year weight of the French monarchy was concentrated into the few inches of space between the blade and the stone. The release of the rope was a sound that no one who heard it would ever forget, a sharp, metallic hiss followed by a dull, heavy thud that vibrated through the very ground. When the executioner held the head aloft, the silence finally broke. A roar went up from the crowd, a sound that was less a cheer and more a release of pent-up terror. They had done it. They had killed the sun. But as the blood began to pool on the wooden boards, dripping through the cracks and staining the mud below, a new reality began to settle over Paris. The death of the king did not bring the promised peace or the sudden arrival of utopia. Instead, it signaled the beginning of a hunger that could not be satisfied. The machine had been blooded, and it had found the taste to its liking. The lawyers in the National Convention, the men who had orchestrated this moment, looked at each other with a new kind of fear in their eyes. They had unleashed a force that recognized no rank, no merit, and no mercy. The revolution had moved past the stage of ideas and into the stage of pure kinetic survival. The shadow of the blade began to stretch across the city, growing longer with every passing hour, reaching into the salons, the bakeries, and the bedrooms of the innocent and the guilty alike. The turning point had been reached, and there was no going back. The blade was up again, reset by the mechanical hands of the executioners, waiting for the next name on the list. The machine was now the only true citizen of France, the only one whose position was secure, and the only one who would never be hungry. The silence returned to the square, but it was a different silence now. The silence of a predator that has just begun its hunt. The scent of copper and old wood clings to the damp walls of the conciergerie, a smell that lingers long after the daily carts have departed for the square. It is the smell of a nation's sweat, the metallic tang of fear distilled into a fine mist that coats the lungs of everyone who breathes the stagnant air of the prison. In the cells below the level of the river, the distinction between day and night has dissolved into a perpetual flickering twilight provided by guttering tallow candles. There is no longer a need for clocks in Paris. Time is now measured by the heavy, rhythmic thud of the jailer's keys against his thigh and the calling of names from a parchment list. When the king died, many believed the bloodletting would satisfy the hunger of the new republic, that the sacrifice of the ultimate symbol would bring a period of calm reflection. They were wrong. The death of the sovereign did not close a wound. It tore open a portal. The vacuum left by the crown was quickly filled by a new, more demanding deity. The state. This deity does not reside in a palace or a cathedral, but in the frantic scratching of pens across arrest warrants and the fevered deliberations of men who have convinced themselves that the only way to save the people is to purge them. Every morning, the list grows. Every evening, the cells are emptied. This is the new economy of existence, where the currency is loyalty and the price of inflation is a human life. The revolution has moved from the streets into the very architecture of the human mind. The obstacles are no longer barricades or royalist armies. They are the invisible boundaries of thought and speech. In the bread lines, where mothers wait for hours for a handful of grey flour, the conversation has withered into a series of cautious nods and hollow platitudes. To complain about the price of grain is to grumble against the Republic. To grumble against the Republic is to be a counter-revolutionary. To be a counter-revolutionary is to be a corpse in waiting. The Revolutionary Tribunal has become a factory of rapid-fire justice, where the burden of proof has been replaced by the burden of suspicion. It is a world where silence is interpreted as dissent and enthusiasm is scrutinized for signs of insincerity. The men who once sat in the cafes debating the rights of man now sit in the shadows, wondering if their latest pamphlet will be read as a manifesto or a confession. The law of suspects has turned every apartment building into a panopticon, where the walls have ears and the person sharing your table might be the one who signs your death warrant. This is the true anatomy of the collapse, not the falling of a Bastille, but the shattering of the trust that allows a society to function. Deep within the soul of the revolutionary, a terrifying transformation is taking place. Imagine a man who entered the struggle with a heart full of fire and a mind full of Virgil and Rousseau. He believed in the perfectibility of man, in the idea that if you could only strip away the corruptions of the old regime, a natural virtue would blossom like a spring flower. Now, that same man sits in a cold office, staring at a list of names. He recognizes some of them. They are the names of men he broke bread with, men who helped him write the very laws he is now using to destroy them. He feels a tightening in his chest, a flicker of what used to be called conscience. But then he hears the distant roar of the crowd, or the sharp, insistent voice of a colleague reminding him that any hesitation is a betrayal of the cause. He tells himself that his personal feelings are a luxury the revolution cannot afford. He convinces himself that his fear is actually a form of purity. To feel pity for the enemy is to be an enemy yourself. He begins to view his own emotions as suspicious, a lingering remnant of his aristocratic upbringing that must be suppressed. He is becoming a ghost, a hollow vessel for a machine that requires absolute, unblinking obedience. The internal monologue is no longer a conversation with himself, but a constant, frantic rehearsal of his own defense, even when no one is accusing him. The situation in the provinces has become a nightmare of scorched earth and mass drownings. While Paris remains the nervous system of the terror, the limbs of the country are flailing in a paroxysm of fratricidal violence. In the Vendée, the revolution has encountered a resistance it cannot understand, a peasantry that clings to its priests and its old ways with a ferocity that defies the logic of the Enlightenment. The response from the capital is not negotiation, but annihilation. The infernal columns march through the countryside, leaving nothing but ash and bone in their wake. They do not see people. They see obstacles to progress. In Nantes, the guillotine is deemed too slow for the volume of the condemned. A new, more efficient method is devised: the drownings. Hundreds are stripped, bound together, and loaded onto barges that are then scuttled in the middle of the river. The Loire becomes a graveyard of the nameless. In the minds of the men in Paris, these are not tragedies. They are necessary logistical adjustments. They have reached a point of psychological detachment where the individual human being has been replaced by a mathematical variable. They are no longer governing a nation. They are performing a surgery on the body politic, and they have decided that the only way to save the patient is to amputate the majority of its limbs. The turning point arrives not with a grand battle, but with the fall of the Girondins, the very men who had been the architects of the Republic. These were the intellectuals, the orators, the moderate dreamers, who believed that the revolution could be contained within the banks of the law. They had argued for the king's life, not out of love for the monarchy, but out of a fear of the chaos that his execution would unleash. They were the last barrier between the rule of law and the rule of the mob. When the decree for their arrest is finally issued, it is a signal that the revolution has officially begun to devour its own creators. One of them, Jacques-Pierre Brissot, a man who had spent his life fighting for liberty, now finds himself in the same damp cell that once held the king. He looks at the graffiti on the walls, the names of those who have already passed through this purgatory, and he realizes that the logic he helped build has no place for him. He had believed in the power of words, in the ability of reason to navigate the storm. But he now understands that in a storm of this magnitude, reason is nothing but a leaf in a gale. The tribunal that tries them is a mockery, a choreographed dance toward the inevitable. They are not allowed to present a defense. Their very eloquence is turned against them, viewed as a tool of deception. As the Girondins are led to the scaffold, they sing. It is a defiant, haunting melody that rises above the jeers of the crowd, a final assertion of their humanity in the face of a machine that seeks to erase it. They go to their deaths one by one, each man watching his friend fall before it is his turn. The efficiency of the guillotine is on full display. The blade falls, the head is removed, the body is cleared, and the next man is stepped forward. It is a production line of mortality. For the people watching, The spectacle has become a daily ritual, a form of dark theatre that provides a temporary release for their own anxieties. They cheer because if they do not cheer, they might be noticed. They scream for blood because the smell of it makes them feel, for a fleeting moment, like they are the ones in power. But as the last of the Girondins falls, a new information begins to circulate through the city, a whisper that changes the very nature of the fear. The Committee of Public Safety has declared that the terror is no longer a temporary measure. It is the order of the day. It is the permanent state of the Republic. This realization is the moment the moral collapse becomes absolute. The promise of a return to normalcy is revealed to be a lie. The machine will not stop until there is no one left to feed it. The paranoia that had been a localized fever now becomes a systemic infection. The leaders of the revolution, men like Robespierre and Saint-Just, move through the streets surrounded by a cold, invisible wall. They have become the high priests of the blade, convinced that they alone possess the moral clarity to navigate the blood. They no longer look their colleagues in the eye. Every conversation is a tactical maneuver, every silence a potential threat. They have created a world where the only way to prove you are not a traitor is to be the first to accuse someone else. The revolution has ceased to be about building a new world. It has become a desperate, clawing struggle to avoid being the next name on the list. The sun sets over a city that is paralyzed by its own shadow. A city where the only thing more dangerous than being an enemy of the state is being its friend. The machine sits in the center of the square, its iron heart cold and waiting, a silent witness to the fact that power, once it has tasted the blood of its own children, never knows when to stop. The summer of 1794 arrives in Paris, not as a season of warmth and growth, but as a suffocating, airless weight that smells of sun-baked blood and stagnant water. The guillotine has been moved from the center of the city to the edge, to the Place du Trône Renversé, because the residents of the wealthier districts could no longer endure the stench of the soil. The earth has reached its saturation point. The ground beneath the scaffold is a dark, viscous mire that no amount of sawdust can fully mask, a physical manifestation of a political process that has lost all sense of proportion. In this atmosphere, the concept of a batch takes on a gruesome, industrial meaning. The carts no longer carry individuals, they carry categories. Today it is the former nobles, tomorrow the tailors, the day after the poets. The machine has transitioned from a tool of punishment into a tool of demographic management. There is no longer even the pretense of a trial in the way the old world understood the term. The law of 22 Prairial has stripped away the right to legal counsel and the requirement for witnesses. Justice is now defined by the moral proof held in the hearts of the accusers. If the state feels you are a threat, you are a threat. The distance between an accusation and the fall of the blade has been reduced to a matter of hours. This is the Great Terror, a period where the revolution has stopped trying to convince the world of its righteousness and has instead decided to simply outlive its enemies. The architects of this system, men who once spent their nights drafting constitutions for the benefit of all humanity, now spend their days in a state of high-alert exhaustion. Maximilien Robespierre, the man they call the Incorruptible, moves through the corridors of power with the rigid, brittle grace of someone who is afraid that a single misplaced word will shatter his entire reality. He has become a prisoner of his own purity. To him, the revolution is a sacred flame that must be protected from the damp winds of compromise and corruption, but the flame has grown into an inferno that he can no longer control, only feed. He sees enemies everywhere, in the shadows of the doorways, in the hesitant pauses of his colleagues, in the very silence of the streets. He has convinced himself that the only way to achieve the Republic of Virtue is through the application of terror. In his mind, these are not two opposing forces, but two sides of the same coin. Virtue without terror is powerless. Terror without virtue is murderous. But as he looks around the table at the Committee of Public Safety, He must wonder if any of them still remember what virtue looks like. Their faces are masks of grey fatigue, their eyes reflecting the frantic calculation of men who know that their names are likely on a list held by the person sitting next to them. Among these men, one figure stands out as the ultimate personification of the revolution's physical and emotional appetite, Georges Danton. He is a man of the earth, a giant with a voice that can shake the walls of a cathedral and a face scarred by smallpox and the rough handling of life. If Robespierre is the cold, analytical brain of the movement, Danton was its heart and its lungs. He was the one who rallied the nation when the Prussian armies were at the gates, the one who told the people that to defeat the enemies of France, they needed boldness, more boldness, and always boldness. But the man who sits in his cell in the spring of 1794 is a different Danton. He is tired. He is heavy with the weight of the things he has seen and the things he has done. He was the one who established the Revolutionary Tribunal, the very instrument that is now being used to dismantle him. "I ask pardon from God and men for having instituted the tribunal," he whispers to the damp walls. He has begun to realize that the machine he built does not have a shut-off valve. It is a perpetual motion device that converts human lives into political momentum. He had hoped to steer the revolution toward a period of clemency, to stop the killing and begin the building. But in a world governed by the logic of the purge, the call for mercy is the ultimate heresy. In the dead of night, the silence of the prison is broken by the sound of Danton's laughter, a deep, booming sound that carries a hint of madness. He mocks the guards, he mocks the judges, and most of all he mocks himself. He reflects on his life as if it were a play written by a drunken god. He remembers the early days, the intoxication of the Palais Royal, the belief that they were standing at the beginning of a new history. He thought he was the master of the storm, but he now sees that he was just a piece of debris being carried by the wind. He thinks of his wife, the one he had exhumed just to see her face one last time, an act of desperate, morbid love that his enemies used as proof of his instability. He realizes that his greatest mistake was not his corruption or his ambition, but his humanity. He stayed too long in the world of flesh and blood, when the revolution had already moved into the world of cold, abstract ideals. He is being executed not for what he did, but for what he refused to become, a machine. The trial of the Dantonists is the moment the last remaining threads of the Republic's soul begin to unravel. Danton does not go quietly. He turns the courtroom into a battlefield, his voice roaring over the protests of the prosecutors, accusing the committee of cowardice and hypocrisy. The people in the galleries, the common citizens of Paris who once worshipped him, find themselves wavering. They see the man they loved, the man who spoke for them when no one else would, being gaggled by a bureaucracy that is afraid of his breath. The authorities, sensing that the crowd might turn, take a desperate step. They pass a decree that any accused person who insults the national justice shall be removed from the debate. It is a death sentence delivered by a pen. Danton is led away, still shouting, his words echoing through the halls like the prophecy of a dying giant. "You are all following me," he screams at the judges. "Robespierre will follow me. The house of the revolution is falling." The journey to the scaffold is a long, agonizing procession through the heart of a city that has become a graveyard of its own hopes. Danton sits in the cart, his massive shoulders slumped, but his head held high. Next to him is Camille Desmoulins, the young journalist whose pamphlets had ignited the spark in 1789. Desmoulins is weeping, a broken man who cannot understand how the beautiful dream of liberty resulted in this grey, metallic reality. Danton looks at him with a mixture of pity and frustration. "Peace, my friend," he says. "Leave this rabble alone." As the cart passes the house where Robespierre lives, Danton stands up and bellows a curse that seems to chill the very air. He knows that his death is not an ending, but a precursor. He knows that the blade he is about to face is already being sharpened for the men who sent him there. The crowd is silent now, a heavy, expectant silence that feels like the pressure before a lightning strike. They are witnessing the suicide of the revolution, the moment it cuts out its own tongue. At the foot of the guillotine, Danton is the last to die. He watches as his friends are executed one by one, the sound of the blade falling with a rhythmic, mechanical precision. He does not flinch. He does not pray. He looks at the executioner, Sanson, a man who has become the most important official in France, and delivers his final instruction. "Show my head to the people," he says, his voice steady and devoid of fear. "It is worth the trouble." It is a final act of vanity, but also a final act of defiance. He wants the people to see the face of the man they are allowing to be destroyed. He wants them to look into his dead eyes and see their own future. When the blade falls, the sound is identical to the thousands that came before, but the impact is different. The death of Danton removes the last vestige of balance from the political landscape. There is no longer a counterweight to the ideology of the committee. The acceleration of the terror becomes absolute. In the days that follow, the atmosphere in Paris shifts from fear to a kind of hollowed-out nihilism. The turning point has been passed, and the realization begins to dawn on everyone, from the highest official to the lowest street sweeper, that the revolution is no longer about the people. It is a self-sustaining cycle of death that has no objective other than its own continuation. The new information that circulates in the shadows is not about a new law or a military victory. It is the whispered understanding that the machine has no master. Robespierre, the man who believed he could direct the lightning, is increasingly isolated, his health failing, his mind fracturing under the pressure of his own paranoia. He has succeeded in creating a republic of virtue, but it is a republic populated only by the dead and the terrified. The streets are empty. The theaters are closed. The only place of public assembly is the square where the blade waits. The people look at the scaffold, and they no longer see a symbol of liberty or justice. They see the inevitable conclusion of a logic that began with a dream and ended with a ledger of names. The machine is ready for its next batch, and the list is being written in a hand that no longer shakes. The bandage wrapped around Maximilien Robespierre's jaw is soaked through with dark, blossoming crimson, a silent testament to a botched ending. He lies on a wooden table in the Committee of Public Safety, the very room where he once dictated the fate of millions, but now he is merely a broken object, a piece of discarded machinery. He cannot speak. The man who ruled France through the sheer hypnotic power of his oratory has been silenced by a single lead ball, whether by his own hand or a soldier's musket. There is a profound, cosmic irony in this quietude. For years his words were the blade that fell across the neck of the nation, and now in the final hours of his life he is denied even the right to a last confession. Around him the air is thick with the scent of sweat, gunpowder, and the peculiar electric charge of a power vacuum being filled in real time. His colleagues, the men who once trembled at his slightest frown, now peer at him with a mixture of revulsion and relief. They are looking at a god who has been revealed as a wounded animal. The clock on the wall ticks with a mechanical indifference, marking the seconds until the sun rises on a day that will no longer belong to the incorruptible. The silence in the room is not peaceful. It is the silence of a theatre after the lights have failed, where the actors are left groping in the dark for a script that no longer exists. The collapse did not begin with a shot, but with a list. On the floor of the National Convention, Robespierre had stood before the deputies and announced that there was a new group of traitors among them, a hidden cabal of conspirators who sought to undermine the Republic. But he refused to name them. In that moment of calculated ambiguity, he made his final fatal mistake. He had used fear as a scalpel for so long that he failed to notice it had turned into a sledgehammer. Every man in that room, from the most fervent Jacobin to the most cautious moderate, felt the cold touch of the grave on his shoulder. If everyone was a suspect, then no one was safe, and if no one was safe, then the only logical response was to strike first. The paranoia that Robespierre had cultivated as a weapon of statecraft had finally turned inward, devouring its creator. The roar that went up from the benches, "Down with the tyrant," was not a cry for liberty but a collective scream of self-preservation. They were not defending the Republic, they were defending their own necks. The transition from absolute authority to hunted fugitive happened in the space of a single heartbeat, proving that power is nothing more than a shared hallucination that vanishes the moment the audience stops believing in the illusion. As the dawn breaks over the city, the journey to the scaffold begins, but it is unlike any that have come before. The carts are not filled with the usual assortment of nameless suspects. They carry the inner circle of the terror. Robespierre, Saint-Just, and Couthon are paraded through the streets of Paris, through the very neighborhoods that once looked to them for salvation. The crowd is no longer the disciplined, worshipful assembly of the festival of the Supreme Being. They are a mob, fickle and feral, sensing that the era of restraint has ended. They throw insults, they throw stones, they press against the carts with a desperate, hysterical energy. They are celebrating the death of the man who tried to make them virtuous by force, not realizing that they are also celebrating the end of a vision that, however flawed, had promised them a meaning beyond their own survival. The air is heavy with the heat of July, the month of Thermidor, a name that will forever be synonymous with the cooling of revolutionary passion and the return of the old familiar hungers of the human heart. The guillotine stands waiting in the Place de la Révolution, its iron frame shimmering in the summer heat. It has been the silent auditor of the entire decade, a character that has watched every player enter and exit the stage. Now, it prepares for its most prestigious guests. One by one, the leaders of the committee are led up the stairs. Saint-Just, the angel of death, maintains a cold, stoic silence, his eyes fixed on some distant horizon of pure theory. He dies as he lived, an abstraction in human form. But for Robespierre, the end is physical and messy. When the executioner reaches for the bandage on his face, the scream that erupts from his throat is the only sound in the square, a raw, primal howl of agony that strips away the last remnants of his dignity. The blade falls with the same dull metallic thud that ended the lives of the king, the queen, the Girondins, and Danton. With that single stroke, the great terror is decapitated. The machine has finally consumed its own brain. In the aftermath, a strange, hollow peace settles over the nation. The prisons are opened, and the thousands who were waiting for their names to be called walk out into the sunlight, blinking like ghosts returning to the world of the living. The law of 22 Prairial is repealed, the Revolutionary Tribunal is dismantled, and the name of Robespierre is systematically erased or blackened. The men who orchestrated his fall, many of whom were just as blood-stained as he was, now present themselves as the restorers of order. They call it a victory for humanity, but it is a victory of the mediocre over the fanatical. The high, soaring ideals of 1789 are replaced by a cynical, grasping pursuit of wealth and stability. The revolution does not end with a bang or a new constitution. It ends with the realization that the people are exhausted. They are tired of virtue, tired of blood, and tired of the constant agonizing pressure of being part of a historical process. They want to eat, they want to sleep, and they want to forget. The shadow of the blade remains, but it has become a memory, a ghost that haunts the periphery of the national consciousness. The French Revolution was a decade of instability that attempted to rewrite the very nature of human existence. It was a machine built by men who believed that the end justified the means, only to find that the means eventually become the end. It reveals that power, when divorced from the messy, inconvenient reality of human compassion, becomes a terminal illness. The guillotine was not just a tool of execution, it was a mirror. It showed the world that beneath the wigs and the silk, beneath the revolutionary cockades and the rags of the poor, there is a shared vulnerability that no ideology can bridge. It proved that the descent from reason to madness is a short, slippery slope, paved with the best of intentions and the blood of those who disagree. The tragedy of the revolution is not that it failed to change the world, but that it succeeded in showing us exactly how little it takes to turn a neighbor into an informer and a citizen into a corpse. Now, as the echoes of the blade fade into the pages of history, the question remains for those who look back. What would you have done in that square? Would you have been the one shouting for the king's head, or the one secretly weeping in the shadows? Would you have signed the warrant to save your own life, or would you have walked toward the scaffold with your head held high? History does not execute only kings and enemies. It executes ordinary people who believed they were safe because they were quiet. It consumes the complicit just as readily as it consumes the defiant. The lesson of the terror is not found in the dates or the names of the dead, but in the realization that survival is often the first step toward complicity. At what point does the silence of the witness become the consent of the executioner? The machine is never truly gone. It is merely disassembled, its parts stored in the dark corners of the human psyche, waiting for the next generation to believe that they have finally found the perfect reason to put it back together. The sun sets on the ruins of the old world, leaving behind a warning that is as cold and as sharp as the iron that fell in the Place de la Révolution. Beware of those who offer you a paradise built on a foundation of bone, for eventually it will be your turn to be the mortar.